and Jane and her colleagues take on the challenges and opportunities of developing teaching and the use of technology in that environment, a very cosmopolitan environment. But Jane's experience is also much more wide-ranging than that, and she began her career as a teacher at second level, teaching English at schools in London. And this experience is reflected in her recent cross-sectoral projects with schools in London. When she returned to study, she moved outside her original disciplines and into computer science, and then developed a strong interest in computer-assisted language learning. As for her PhD studies, Jane investigated the design of shared electronic workspaces for small group teaching and learning in Russian. So today she is involved in a range of research and development projects, and she's won funding from a range of authorities too and agencies in Britain, including the GISC, which many of us are familiar with here, CFBT and the Nuffield Foundation, amongst others. And she continues to research and publish widely in this area. She's also involved in teaching on UCL's MA in Education and Certificate in Learning and Teaching in Higher Education. Having had the very good fortune to work with Jane, I can say that she's always combined expertise and a lot of creativity with very pragmatic awareness of life on the ground and what it's like to juggle teaching, research, administration and all the other things people have to do these days. And I'm sure that will be reflected in what she's going to talk to us about today. So it gives me very great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jane Hughes.
I'm going to add a line saying thank you to Claire for that great introduction. But first of all, thank you for the organisers in particular for inviting me. I'm really enjoying myself, and I appreciate the opportunity to come to Ireland and talk to you who are working in a context which is probably similar to mine, but also has interesting differences and thought-provoking differences, perhaps. Secondly, just to say a bit more about where I'm coming from, the basis on which I'm talking. As Claire says, I work in an educational development centre, which makes me a bit of a hybrid. She mentioned I've changed disciplines. I'm also a bit of a learning technologist, a bit of a staff developer. I'm a teacher, and I do research, like a lot of us here. I've always, because I've taught for a long time, I was an English teacher in school, I've always been very interested in the impact of new technologies, the introduction of technologies on teachers and on the teacher's role, which I think for a long time was perhaps underestimated, in making technologies work and choosing the technologies that are appropriate for the learning and teaching. Okay, what's this talk about? Primarily about the relationship between human communication and technology. So, of course, people are at the centre. I'm really relieved, having heard this morning's talk from Larry, that I put that, and I didn't put technology leads the way. So I feel I can stand up here with that. The and part, I put computer-mediated communication and learning. It could have been and quite a lot of other things, actually. It was nearly and design for learning. I'm going to touch on quite a few other things besides that. I should also say I'm interpreting computer-mediated communication pretty widely. And it may not be confined to some of the things that instantly spring to mind. What I'm going to do is look at just 3 examples of real teaching situations in which I think computer-mediated communication is an issue and is interesting, and use those to raise some questions about how communication between people can benefit from technologies and can also be affected both positively and negatively by the use of technologies. I also hope, because I'm really interested in it, to show why computer-mediated communication is important and is interesting and is sometimes just extremely difficult to fathom, to understand. And I think the reason it's difficult is largely because it's people, and people aren't always predictable. Okay, so before looking at these 3 example projects, if you like, a little more context, particularly as I'm conscious I don't work in Ireland, and although from my informal chats to people, I suspect we have very common set of concerns, I don't want to assume that your issues are my issues. So I'm just going to ask you just 30 seconds just to think. What would you put in your top 3 or 4 institutional issues? What's your institution concerned with in terms of learning and teaching? And then I'll tell you what mine is really bothered about. Enough thinking time, I think. I wonder if any of these are on your list. Maybe none. Has anyone got none of those on their list? Well, we've got something in common anyway. Okay, just to run through, these are current preoccupations of my institution and in UK higher education. And I think computer-mediated communication has some part to play in taking forward or thinking about all of those. First of all, internationalisation and global citizenship. People have very different perspectives on this. I think there are some people who think it's yet another initiative that's been foisted on us. But certainly, again, in my institution, particular areas of interest are providing for international students, giving them a fair deal and a good experience, giving all students what some people call an international experience, whatever that might be. It might simply mean emailing somebody in Russia, but it could be something much broader than that and include work and other experiences abroad. And building awareness of global issues and global responsibilities into the curriculum. The student experience is a huge thing. We have a national student survey now, which I think in the first year or so, some institutions didn't take terribly seriously. But when the results started finding their way into league tables and people began to consider that it might affect recruitment, suddenly it became very important. I don't think, I'm not a total cynic, I don't think that's the only reason why people want students to have a good experience at university, but I certainly think it's a factor. Rising out of that, assessment and feedback. Feedback in our National Student Survey is one of the areas where students are less satisfied than others. The feedback they get from their tutors, the timing of it, the nature of it. So that's one thing. Secondly, assessment. It's so central to learning, to all the effort that our students put in to their work and that we put into it. And so, of course, it's also immensely time-consuming for everyone. And it's an area where, with lots of things racing on forward, maybe assessment is still not quite keeping pace, methods of assessment and things. So that's another issue. And again, there is the skills agenda, students developing skills. Some people would say, as was mentioned in one of the points for reflection this morning, that the purpose of education is to turn out students who can take their place in an economic place in society, who can get good jobs. And the skills agenda is related to this. Okay, so going through them all again, I think as far as internationalisation and globalisation is concerned, technology can certainly create opportunities for cross-cultural exchange and communication. It doesn't make it work always, it doesn't solve the problems, and I don't think the main problems of it are technological. As far as the student experience is concerned, the environment that we provide, whether it's virtual learning environment or whatever, for our students to communicate with their tutors and with each other, for them to work collaboratively, is really important and is a key part to their experience at university. As far as assessment and feedback are concerned, I said assessment in some ways is lagging behind, I think. But increasingly you see participation in a forum, for example, being taken into account in assessment. But I think there are lots of other opportunities and lots of questions related to that idea of participation, which are probably worth a lot more consideration. Okay, I'm going to go through two other little bits of context. The first one I'm going to go through really quickly because it's the immediate context. It's now. A few weeks ago when I first got the programme, I just ran through it and tried to jot down a list of the topics that are being covered here. I'm not going to read them all out to you because you know what they are. This was my list. It seems to me that an awful lot of these topics are concerned with people communicating via technologies or around technologies. Secondly, looking at this list of topics, I think leads me on to the final little bit of context, which is actually to look at the ways people study computer-mediated communication, the kinds of studies that people do. And actually they're exactly the same, I think, as the kinds of studies people do of all educational technologies. So what I've done is just, if you look at research that's carried out into educational technology, into computer-mediated communication, it seems to develop really on a continuum from when the technologies are just emerging at the real leading edge to when they become an almost unnoticed, established part of our working environment. And we move through from studies that are really designed to find out what's needed, either what the users need, the learners and the teachers, or what features the system needs, and hopefully the two are linked very closely together. Then to studies where things are being tried out, feasibility studies, through to ones where the goal is to understand the process. How are people learning with this? How exactly do the different bits of technology affect the way the students are collaborating? What's the teacher's role? How's it changing? Those studies of the process, I think, come once it's clear that something's feasible. And then, as something becomes more established, the concern is with evaluation of things that have been in operation for quite some time. And finally, I think you get the studies of studies, the analysis of 50 case studies, which are carried out often by organisations like the JISC, with a view to coming up with some guidelines and standards for good practice in work with that particular kind of technology. Okay, that's the end of my context bit. I'm going to go on to look now at the first little bit of computer-mediated communication, and it's going back over 10 years to 1996. This is when I first moved over from teaching in schools. I was working on, having done a master's, I found myself in a computer science department, having got a job, I think, because it was then quite unusual to have someone who knew quite a lot about teaching an arts subject and had some competence with computers. But I worked with this. Okay? It was called Relate. And we've got lots of jokes about encounter groups and about marriage guidance. Relate stood for Remote Language Teaching, and that's what it was. Small group tutorials were held with each of the participants on an individual workstation. They were geographically in different locations. In fact, it was a collaboration between University College London and University of Exeter, so those were the places they were in. A series of language courses was held, the running from something like 6 weeks to 20 weeks. They were real courses, and some of them were award-bearing. And they were used as a test bed for some technological evaluation and a lot of evaluation of actually what made the communication, the relationships and the learning work in that context. Now, what put that project very much in the past, technologically speaking, was the fact that in order for that to run at all, we had the absolute top-end, most powerful Unix workstations. It couldn't run on any PC. Not only that, but it was more or less one-to-one technical support. And I remember myself, throughout the trials that were running between rooms, carrying headsets, and sometimes phoning up to restore connections. So, although in some ways it's quite advanced, it's still not usual to have 4 or even 8 simultaneous video streams yanked together in one interface like that. But just, so as not to mislead you, it really needed an awful lot of technical support, and it could not have been rolled out at that point by any of us. Okay, so what was it about in terms of communication? What we were really seeking to find out was what made the learning work and the relationships work in a very impoverished communication environment. I say it was impoverished because, first of all, the scope of what you could see was very, very limited. You saw head and shoulders only. Secondly, the quality of what you could see was very poor. It was low-resolution images, quite blocky, and they moved in jerks, not smoothly, because it was very slow frame rate. And it was also taking place in real rooms, so often they weren't very well lit. And you can certainly see variations on that picture where this character is not very visible to the co-participants at all. So, in terms of video, it was impoverished. The audio was probably less than telephone quality. What it didn't have, it was fine for conveying meaning most of the time, but it didn't convey emotions in the way that face-to-face talk can. It didn't have that sort of richness of expression. The shared working space here was a two-dimensional space. You didn't move around in it, you could draw and write in it, and you could point at things. So you'd say that was probably impoverished. I won't go on about it, but how did it all work? I'll say, on the whole, the evaluation suggested that in terms of learning, it was at least as successful as face-to-face tutorials would have been. However, there were costs. The issues that turned out to be important. First of all, I've mentioned quality, audio and video quality. Audio quality, of course, is the key to meaning. If it dropped beyond a certain level, and this was internet-based, it was IP video conferencing, there was no guarantees of quality, so it fluctuated quite a lot. It always imposed an effort on the people listening, and sometimes if it dropped below a certain level, obviously it would be impossible to continue. So audio quality, okay, well we know that's a technological question, but also it was stress related, and the person who led this project actually later went on to hook all sorts of blood pressure and heart rate monitors to participants in such things, to try to actually find some measure of the stress that quality variations brought to them. Now, how stress affects communication is an issue, I think. Okay, video quality was less clear-cut. I think at that time in 1996, people thought there was an answer. If you had this resolution, if the picture was just this sharp and moved just this smoothly, learning would be okay. If it dropped below that, it wouldn't. And of course, there never was really a clear-cut answer. For a start, people particularly in their response to video quality, turned out to be incredibly variable. So some people found the slow frame rate in this so irritating that they preferred not to see it. That was a small minority. Generally, it wasn't possible, and I think, I'm not sure that it has been definitively shown that video quality actually has a really clear impact on learning quality. However, it appeared from this and from other studies that video made the situations on the whole more enjoyable. It had a particular function, it helped to interpret speech. One particular teacher really, I thought, skated quite close to the edge in terms of he liked to joke, he liked sarcasm, he liked irony, he'd say things that face to face you'd realise were a joke. If the students, and they said this also, if they hadn't seen his smiling face, they might have not been too happy with some of the things that were said. So it helped to interpret. It's apparently, according to the participants, helped them feel they got to know one another. That was all. Okay. The next section, awareness. Now, there are two things to this. One, part of the impoverished environment, you don't know who's speaking always. You hear the voice, but if there are 2 male students or 5 male students, you might not be quite sure who it is. So that was a design element built in. The little green bar that the arrow points at showed who was speaking. And more interesting, perhaps, is self-awareness and self-projection. That's a feature of video communication, and that is not a face-to-face. Of course, we are dimly aware of what self we're projecting, as I am at the moment. But in a much more explicit way, you actually can see the image of yourself that is being projected. And this was quite interesting also, because it was a good illustration, I think, of how what people say they do isn't necessarily what they do. Time after time, when through questionnaires and in interviews, if you ask the participants, do you look at your own image? They said no, never or hardly ever. But observation totally contradicted that. And the particular person you can see here also responded never or hardly ever. And actually the first thing he did in every session was to enlarge the picture of his own image. And you would see the students looking at themselves and putting themselves up and seeing out. So quite clearly, being conscious of what you're projecting is something that is a feature of some types of online communication. Okay, and finally, the other issue is just feelings. We've got some presentations relating to affective factors, how feelings impact on learning and how we work with learning technologies. And these sessions were found to be quite intensive, tiring, and also, whether it was to do with the video or partly obviously the small group, students said they felt there was no place to hide, they felt exposed, they were conscious always that they were on view, and that had both positive possibly and negative points. There were also things to do with the relationships, the feelings. One group, in fact this group I think, met their tutor only after their course of sort of 10 weeks had ended. And they reported that they only realised when they met him that they did know him. They hadn't really thought of it as having helped them get to know the person, but it had. Another interesting one, which is only a one-off, one of the students said, "He's so little, I could say anything to him." And seemed to have actually made her feel that this little image was not so scary as a teacher. And so just a little illustration, but certainly perhaps shows that we don't always relate to computer images in the way that we relate to real people. lots of other things. Interactions tended to be a little bit more structured, more use of names, rather than throwing out a general question to the class, more structured sort of turn-taking, you, question to you, question to you, question to you. I think probably I'll move on then and generalise from that a little bit. This project is an example, I think, of looking at computer-mediated communication from a particular perspective, and that is a computer science perspective in a way, because it was a collaboration between a computer science department and an education centre, a bit like the one I work in now. So that the things that were of interest were the things that were of interest to people who research the impact of technologies on people's working environment through computer-supported cooperative work, CSCW, human-computer interaction, later computer-supported collaborative learning, and they are things like the media, how interactive, how expressive is the audio or video. Is it persistent? By persistence, I mean when I'm speaking now, it doesn't hang there in the air for you to grab that word back and look at it again. Unlike text communication, which you can scroll back and look at. Of course, times have changed and there'll be recordings, so you will be able to look back, but not in quite the same way. Matching tasks to media. What's an appropriate learning task for this particular set of media? What role does the audio, video and the text play in this learning situation? How does multimedia affect learning? That's just one perspective on it, and it is a very, one that comes from computer science. Studies of human communication, and really the idea is these things are important face-to-face. What happens when you've got computers? So people being aware of what each other, what they're doing, who's speaking, what are they doing, where are they, what are they looking at? Use of gesture to point things out. Being aware of where you're looking. In only the most sophisticated video conferencing systems can you tell what people are looking at, and even then it's kind of mocked up. Eye contact, which I'm able to make now, but obviously you don't make in a real situation video conferencing. People have also studied, gender, related to participation, analysing dialogues in relation to learning. And then lots and lots of studies about group work and collaboration and communication that goes on there. Analysing activities and learning tasks, roles and relationships, impact of group size, then coming on to affective factors, motivation and enjoyment, the process of doing the task as opposed to the outcome. So those things are important, and I think they're important in whatever situation you're studying, but they're not the only things. And I think technologies have changed and time has moved on, and there are some other factors, I think, that need to be taken into consideration. Another difference is that this Relate project was about distance education. I don't know, I guess the majority of you, like me, work in campus-based institutions where we have the option of communicating face-to-face, and we're usually mixing that up with computer-mediated communication. So what I did is I actually Googled one of the people who worked on that project to find out what he's interested in now, because I thought that might give me a link to so what's the modern equivalent? And I got that article in The Guardian written at the end of 2006 by, his name is David Henshaw. He actually did his PhD as a mature student. He's a lecturer at the University of Westminster. He did his PhD around that and other projects looking at video communication and learning. So that's one of the places it led me. But I also wanted to follow up this idea of the environment in which people are communicating. So another place that I think we might make a link is this one. And this is an EduServe symposium last year in Second Life. Did anyone here participate in that? I wondered. A couple of my colleagues at UCL.
Sorry.
Sort of.
Watched it just after the finish.
Okay. A couple of my colleagues at UCL did, and this is a lot of questions raised by this. I wonder, though, is this? The two questions I've raised in relation to that is one: is this an impoverished environment compared with real life, or is it an enriched environment? I don't have a lot of experience within Second Life, but the little bits I've seen, and I was at a conference recently where we were linked up in Second Life, they have these idyllic, peaceful seaside scenes. Now, is that an environment that somehow is calming and promoting of reflection? We have campfire conversations, as well as the more traditional kind of lecture theatre situation that is not too distinct from this one. That's one of the questions I think that's raised, and the new things that weren't there in 96. And the second is that I think it takes forward the idea of self-projection. And I had to not do my next slide. I was going to cycle through a few pictures of people's avatars, and then I came across a story of somebody who's went to court because her avatar was misused, in her view, by YouTube. And I wondered then about ownership and copyright, and should I just grab things like those pictures off the internet. But all the same, if you are a lecturer and you are relating to your students through a virtual environment, what choices are you going to make about how you project yourself? Are you going to need to know what kind of figure students are most likely to believe, telling them about physics or archaeology? Are you going to need to know what kind of a figure students feel comfortable with giving them feedback on a rather poor piece of work? There are lots of ways in which you're going to construct some kind of an identity for yourself. That's from the lecturer's point of view, and of course everybody participating is actually constructing something which can be anything at all. So that's a sort of a taking forward of that self-projection and identity idea. As far as podcasting is concerned, there's the new idea, I think, that wasn't there in 1996 when we talked about video conferencing, is publication, putting stuff out there perhaps for people you know, perhaps for your own classes, but also for an audience that you might not know, to take and do whatever they want with. So it raises the question of how the communication might be affected by the intended audience effect, or by not being sure about that. And also, I think, another way of looking at computer-mediated communication is from a sort of information literacy, computer literacy point of view. Should we now be expecting lecturers and students to develop media production skills, the skills that they'll need for publication, and that kind of broadcast type communication? Okay, I'm going to move on now. Up to now, I've been talking about distance education, or work in virtual worlds, or things where people aren't co-located. I'm going to move on now to the classroom, because the context for my next illustration is the one that probably most of us work in. Okay, I chose this. It's probably one of the earliest manifestations of technology in the classroom. It's a language lab. I chose it particularly because of those nice big barriers between the students. I felt that doesn't make you think about student-student communication. It suggests your main relationships with the technology if you're a student. It also raises the question of what the teacher's doing and how the teacher is relating to the students and communicating with the students. And I would guess the teacher has a monitoring role here, is able to listen in and dip in and communicate via the technology with individual students. And that's also the case in the example I'm going to do next. Here we have a stage further on, a traditional classroom into which computers have been put. And a teacher here going around the class talking to students in a way that we will recognise whether or not there are computers in the room, I think. And finally, we have the purpose-built, the designed. This one apparently is designed for flexible interactions. Flexibility is the key when people talk about it. It is in my own institution. Supposedly, it enables you to switch between working on computers, working completely without computers, talking to each other across computers, and it has all sorts of flexible devices to enable the teacher to grab student screens, to broadcast his or her own. Interestingly, though, I think it's a very good example of how designers, developers of technologies and rooms in which they work need to look at what the practitioners really do. Because actually this is flexible for the students, it's completely inflexible for the teacher. The teacher can only actually operate anything from one place, and it's modelled on the idea, oh, the teacher has a desk, there's the teacher's desk. Actually, if you observe people in this room, the kinds of communications, the teacher actually wants to go and talk to a small group of students, and you see them running back and forwards, and it's not possible for the tutor to come and sit with a group of students, log into this computer, and do what they need to, and have the same kind of control that they have from the teacher's desk. So that's the context. Now, the next example actually takes place over quite a long period, about 3 years, in this room and in this room. Okay, it's probably a slightly less well-known bit of technology as well, so I will. Okay, it's called NTE, Network Text Editor. It stands for. I've got a reference in the back. It is downloadable. It's old. It was developed actually. As part of his PhD by someone who's now a professor of computer science, Mark Handley. The only written, published reference to it is highly technical, but I've put there's lots of documentation on the webpage that I've put in the references. I need to probably explain, because I'm not going to assume everyone knows what a shared text editor is, or a shared workspace. I've talked about this at quite a lot of conferences, and I always think I've done a good job of explaining it, and realise afterwards that some people haven't quite understood what happened. Basically, if you imagine the situation in the classroom when each of the students has this bit of software running, they can all see that page. Everyone can type in it at the same time. Everyone can scroll up and down in it. Their names are, well, the names of the machines in this case are here. They can identify themselves by colour. There are other ways, but in this situation they were identified by colour. They can all edit each other's. They can even delete each other's, actually. They can move stuff around. Simple edits. It's not a word processor. You just do simple little actions on it. So it's a kind of shared writing space that in real time. As I say, I haven't... the other thing you can do is you can point at things, which I've just done, and that's very important, I think, in any communication, to be able to indicate something. Recently, when I was trying to describe this tool, somebody said, "Oh, a real-time wiki," and I guess it is. But of course, whereas a wiki is, you can produce something over time and polish it up. This is very much a sort of sketching and drafting and note-making tool for quick interactions. It's a bit like text chat, except there's a crucial difference, is that you can actually move around in a space. And I think that affects the communication in subtle ways. For example, this is a bit of Russian, so if this blue bit that I'm indicating here said, what are you doing tonight? No, that's not, yes, all right, let's say, what are you doing tonight? You could sit, or, no, that's a really bad question, sorry. What I'm trying to say is, you can just say yes. So, would you like to go to the cinema? You can just say yes. And I think if you're working in chat room, you can say, yes, I'd like to go to the cinema, because by the time you type in your yes, 17 other people have also said something, and it's not clear what you're answering to. So that's probably a point that isn't terribly clear unless you actually see it in action. But I think this ability to move around in a place in communication potentially is quite important. Okay, I'm going to just ask you, have you got a rough idea of what that tool does? I'm getting mainly nods. Okay, what happened with it was that over a period of 3 years with different classes, this teacher used it for real in the classroom to teach the same course each year, which was an advanced Russian writing course. So it was a language class, but a lot of what was being done would have applied to developing students' writing even in their own language. What's an appropriate way to address something? How do you start an essay? That kind of thing. Over that time, the use developed considerably. I won't go into details of that. I'm just going to ask you now, slightly longer, I gave you 30 seconds before, I'm just going to ask for a 2-minute talk break. If you can try and predict or try and think, what do you think the teachers and students would have found as plus points and minus points? What might they have liked and not liked about that? What might have been the issues? Just think for 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, that's fine. Briefly about them. Obviously, this was collaborative writing. Feedback from teachers to students was important. Writing in public. Partial anonymity. I'm just going to go around and I'll pick on a few of these. Okay. Starting with in the top right-hand corner, they were writing in public. Students were seen and could see other people's. some level of anxiety amongst some students, not enough to stop them doing it. They all participated very, very keenly. It might have been tempered by the fact that they were partially anonymous. They were identified by colours, but nothing else. So you'd sometimes hear someone saying, "Who's blue? Who's blue?" But they didn't really know who was writing what. Collaborative writing together and seeing other students' work. This is seeing other students' work is like the "do you look at your own image?" Do you ever look at other students, what other students are writing? No, never or hardly ever. And then they'd make a comment about what another student had written. And so that's one. So as it actually takes place, they are able to see each other's, and there was evidence that they interacted with each other's. But because the text was persistent, that was able to take place not only at the time, but later on. So the teacher was able to, first of all, make the language that was used in the class an object of the lesson. You could go back and look at it and study it. It was possible to save the text, so it could be edited and brought into another class for that class to interact with, so that there was a sort of cumulative reuse. So that it was communication by sharing, if you like, and sharing of writing. Almost the most interesting thing to me is the students' perceptions about their relationship with the teacher and what the teacher said about her role. The students were almost unanimous in saying that they had closer contact with the teacher, a more individual relationship, more individual feedback from the teacher. The teacher knew what they were doing as individuals, more than if they'd been doing writing without this tool. And also, that was something that they valued. So being seen, the fact that the teacher was aware of them, was an important factor to the students. Next point, the question of who's in charge, people or technology. These kind of tools are sometimes designed with very rigid controls, right? Who can write what, when, where, who can see what, forcing everybody to look at the same thing at the same time. This one doesn't, partly because it was someone's PhD project. And actually, I think one thing about designing tools for communication is that people are really good at managing their communications, and they don't need technology to do it for them, for the most part. There are confusions and frustrations that can arise out of misunderstandings, but there are in real life, and people usually resolve them. So really what I'm flagging up about this one is communication simply by sharing, or by awareness. The question of people being in charge of conducting their communications and their relationships. Question of being able to reuse the communications through their persistence. And affective factors again, the sense of being valued as an individual. And the other one, which came out from student questionnaires and interviews, was that they were more conscious that they were working together on the same thing. And there is a paper by Eileen Scanlon at the Open University, which I haven't put in the reference, which suggests that sense of sharing, that knowing other people are working on the same thing can increase your persistence. Seeing other students also working away. So maybe that was motivating. Maybe. Not so sure. Okay. My last illustration, and Claire is looking meaningfully at me. Okay, this is an example of cross-cultural communication. It's a project called Cross-Call, school-university collaboration, using an asynchronous discussion forum. The students were put in pairs across the sectors. Used 3 languages initially, German, Spanish, Russian. It's still going on, this project. They've just added Arabic, and they're adding a sort of community languages focus. Topics were partly guided by the teachers, but only in a very broad, general way by suggesting a topic or an activity. There were some face-to-face introductions, and there were the usual real-life constraints, like firewalls and things like that had to be got over. Okay, other ways of looking at computer-mediated communication, and I'm going to talk about each of those very briefly on the next page, that we're actually communicating on a multilingual internet. It's online written language in which people can choose what language they use. Often, in this situation, all the pairs who were collaborating had at least 2 languages between them. There's been a study by Durham, which is in the list, of Swiss medical students' use of choice of language on a mailing list, in which they use English, for example, as a sort of lingua franca, the best language we've got in common. But also, they suggested sometimes, for questions of identity, rather than the language of another community in your own country, use a language that is a bit more neutral. Code switching from one language to another, which happens in spoken communication, also happens in written. Obviously the blurring of distinctions between speaking and writing, greater informality, how writers adapt to technical constraints. An example of that is a phenomenon called Greeklish, in which because the internet was invented by English speakers, they didn't take account of languages where they needed different characters. And so the sounds of the Greek language have been, though it's changing obviously and has changed recently, rendered in Roman characters, which some people disparage and some people just think, well, it'll pass when they fix the technology. There's also a question of how languages might influence one another, but I won't go into too much detail there because we're short of time.